Buenas tardes a todos. Buonasera a tutti. Good afternoon to everybody. My name is Antonio Ocampo Guzman. I am the chair of the Department of Theater here at Northeastern University. And it is my pleasure to welcome you to this first event, the first collaboration between the Department of Theater and the Center for Design in the College of Arts, Media and Design. This collaboration started on a sunny afternoon when Paolo Cucarelli, who is the director of the Center for Design, and I had our first conversation. And I discovered that Paolo's family comes from the theater. And I said, well, we need to do a lot of interesting things together. And as we continue to send our department of theater into the field of creative practice research, the notion of us engaging with other disciplines is very, very important and fascinating. So when Paolo told me about Federica's amazing work and I learned more about it, I thought, well, this could be the perfect first event for us. So it is with great pleasure that I welcome you to this event. Just know that this is being recorded and that the recording will be available after the presentation and the conversation. And without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce my colleague, Paolo Cucarelli, the director of the Center for Design. Paolo.
Thank you, Antonio, for this nice presentation. And indeed, I've different connections with theater, and I'm really happy to be in a university where a department of theater exists, because I finally, I can have spend some time in trying to develop some of these connections. And the mission of the Center for Design is to foster this kind of interdisciplinary collaborations through design. And to me, this contamination, it's a term that I'm not sure you, Antonio, likes pretty much, but this contamination between theater and information design, or design more in general, seems to me very, very promising. So, and actually, I think we gonna have imagined someone better than Federica to start to trigger this interdisciplinary relationship. As we have known each other for a long time with Federica. I was her supervisor at Politecnico in Milano, where she graduated in the Communication Design Master Program with a thesis that actually was the exploration through data and visualization of the intricate connections of criminal organizations in the north of Italy, something very, very complex. And then she worked some years at Accurate, a renowned information design agency based in Milano, New York City. And then she started a career as a freelancer, working for National Geographic, the UN, Scientific American, among others. But in the meantime, he's been, able to cultivate this passion she has for theater. And there was something that always intrigued me. So this idea that she was, playing with data on one side and theater on the other. So I think that's really, I think she's an example of this contamination again between science and humanities that I think it's very fruitful nowadays in the field of data. So she managed also, and that's why she's here today, to make an experiment with both design, data, and theater, and to all together in a piece that she wrote and performed. So again, without further ado, I leave the stage to Federica for her presentation that will trigger hopefully a conversation that we will have at the end with question and answers, and hopefully really a dialogue between the two disciplines and all the guests that we have here. It's very open. It's half and half this event, so it's Federica talking, but it's a dialogue between disciplines that we want to foster here. So Federica, the stage is yours.
Thank you so much for the introduction, and mostly thank you for having me here. I'm very glad of it. Let me know if you're seeing my screen. Great. Okay. So everyone. I'm Federica Fragapane, and as Paolo mentioned, I work full-time as data visualization designer, and I love theater as actress and writer. I love experimenting and trying to push the boundaries of my job and mixing it with different things. And data visualization and theater are the two words that I've tried to combine. In general, this is what I'm interested into. Main purpose of my job is to communicate to people, and the same is for theater. So I would say that this flow, this connection is what I more often work on. And thinking about the relationship that such two words can have, mutualism is the term that comes to my mind. Mutualism is the association between organisms of two different species in which each benefits. And I think that both the components can benefit by being combined, both theater and data visualization. And this is what I'm going to talk about now. But first, I'll talk very quickly about these words separately, or at least about how I experience them. So I usually work on data visualizations, collaborating with magazines and organizations. I'm co-author of the children's book Planet Earth, in which I combine data vids and illustrations, and co-author of the Atlante Geopolitico dell'Acqua, an atlas published in Italy dealing with water-related topics. I'm also author of The Stories Behind the Line, another experiment I did, a visual narrative of 6 asylum seekers' route, told through the shapes and the data that characterize their experiences. And during the past few years, I worked with the United Nations, BBC, Scientific American, Google, and with the Italian newspaper Corriere della Sera. I first started approaching data visualization in 2011 when I attended the density design course during my studies at Politecnico di Milano. And as Paolo mentioned, my master degree thesis is a visual analysis of organized crime in Northern Italy, explored through the tools of text mining and data visualization. And I really love the possibility that data visualization offers to explore complex and urgent topics. Then in 2012, I started working at Accurate, a data visualization agency based in Milan and New York, and I worked there for 3 years. And in 2015, I decided to start as freelancer because I was very curious to see how my career would have evolved. I work on different projects in terms of complexity, needs, usage context, and also readers. But the common focus for me is the connection that a data visualization piece can create with the readers. And I'm particularly interested in studying such connection and how the shapes and the visual elements I work with can have an impact on it. And I want you to quickly show you the usual design process behind some of my works to give you a glimpse of what I usually work on as data visualization designer. And taking as example the visualizations I designed for La Lettura, the cultural supplement of the Italian newspaper Corriere della Sera. La Lettura is a weekly cultural supplement and it's published during the weekend. This is a very important aspect. I often see the photographs shared by La Lettura reader, and the average one is a picture of La Lettura next to a cup of coffee or a tea or a brioche in a context that suggests as the reading act is part of a relaxing Sunday morning and lazy Sunday morning. So reading La Lettura is a slow process, and knowing this aspect is a very important aspect for my design approach to the visualizations. I like to think about them as the visual equivalent of long articles. And this equivalence, visualizations and words and article is something I will also talk about it later. A way, anyway, to create an interest, slow reading connection with the reader. My usual design process is mainly composed of these 3 phases: selection of sources, of data analysis, and definition of a specific visual model. And I usually propose the topics to be visualized. And as data visualization designer, and also as actress, I'm a person, we are people talking to other people. And this is the first common point with theater that I see from data visualization. In this case, from the data visualization perspective, during the research and design processes, I find useful starting from a personal point of view and trying to put myself in the potential reader's shoes, asking myself, what would interest me as reader? Always trying to keep in mind the potential readers. And again, this is another common point I see. For the visualization, I'm very quickly going to show you. I visualize data about the CO2 emissions for 40 countries, analyzing the changes over time from 1992 to 2012. And an important phase for me is the inspiration one. I usually spend a lot of time looking for visual inspiration, not only when I have to start a new project, but almost every day. And I really like to pay attention to the shapes, the textures, and to understand which visual elements could be for me the visual elements with whom catch the reader's attention. And in this case, I had found this image, and I like the idea of using it as possible visual inspiration because I find it very beautiful, but also slightly creepy. And so I like the idea of trying to use this combination of feelings. And after analyzing the data, I designed the main structure of the piece that is a phase that has two kinds of influences. The data, of course, that I study and filter and examine, but also the visual inspiration phase. I've noticed during the years that this phase really helps me in defining visual structures. And in this case, after having analyzed the data and having looked for inspiration, I decided to use for each country these elements whose length represents the CO2 emitted by year. And then after having visualized all the data for all the countries, I really spend a lot of time on the details, on the look and feel, because I really think that this kind of detail element can help me in having an engaging connection with the readers. Then I worked on another narrative layer, that is something that I often do, that in this case is the color that represents the change in the emissions over the previous year. Red indicates increased emissions and blue decreased ones. And then I added another layer that is the renewable energy consumption as percentage of the total final energy consumption in 1992 and 2012, to add again an additional layer of information to allow the exploration of the topics with a more contextual data. And this is the final visualization. So you see, there are some elements that can be quickly seen as the size of certain countries, but there are also elements that need time to be read in a slow reading connection between the reader and the piece. And again, the term connection is a common point I see with theater. When I work on my visualizations, as I mentioned, I always have to keep in mind my potential readers, clearly explaining what is happening with a legend, for instance, trying to catch the reader's attention with the shapes I'm working on, as I was showing you. And this also happens on a stage. The connection with the audience is essential. And I think that keeping constantly this concept in mind while acting also helped me in having it in mind while designing. I think this is very important. And then there is another common point for me. When I work on complex visualizations as one for La Lettura, I used to think about them as a visual equivalent of a written piece, of long articles in this case. And designing visualizations is an act similar to the writing one for me. I'm writing with visual alphabets and sometimes also experimenting on new visual letters. But as I mentioned, I also love using more classical letters and alphabets writing for theater. So let's jump to this second universe, the theater one. And let's go back in time again. For me, theater arrived in 2002. I was in high school and I had attended a theater course there only because some friends of mine were attending it too. I was sure I would not have been able to stay on a stage. Every week, I repeated myself different lies, such as, okay, I'm just attending this course, but I won't act on a stage. Or, okay, I'm doing the final play rehearsals, but I'll drop the project in a few weeks. Of course, I can't act on a stage. And then, okay, I'm acting on a stage. And I had to say one single sentence in more than an hour of play. And is in the worst cliches, I fell in love with theater as soon as I pronounced it in front of an audience. Choosing between theater and design was a constant dilemma. But although I focused my studies on design, I kept on acting. And in 2012, I also wrote my first play, Io sono la pelle, I am the skin in English. Me and my friends and theater mates brought the piece, the show in different places, and it was such a beautiful experience. So again, at that time, I was also started working in data visualization at Accurate and experimenting a lot with it. I was enthusiastic about both these worlds that were in a very good point in that moment. And probably this is why I started thinking about the idea of combining them, of mixing them. Or more simply, because I wanted to give myself the possibility of mixing the job I'm passionate about with the thing in general I'm passionate about. I already mentioned some common points that are common in my opinion between data visualization and theater, and I think there are a couple more. They convey. Data visualization usually conveys stories and information. Theater conveys stories and emotions. They visualize. Data visualization does it, obviously, but theater too. Bringing a play on a stage means visualizing it and giving shape to the words through the actors, the gestures, the costumes. And there are many visual choices behind a play. And again, yes, they are the result of choices. Every element of a visualization is carefully chosen, and so it is for theater. Both the position of an element in a visualization and of an actor on a stage are the results of choices. And the fact that that element / actor are in that particular position means something. But let's go to the main point, that is how. Some time ago, I wrote my second play. Il punto è questo, this is the point. It's a simple story that talks about the relationship between three people. I already had the theater component, the play, and I took the data directly from there. And I wanted to take data visualization and to use it to empower the message, providing another version of a story, a purely visual one, designed by the data that were already in my play. Being the author of the play, its words are particularly important to me. In my visualizations, every element has its own function, and it has been drawn because of it. I tend to avoid any decorativism, and I realized that the same thing happens with the words in the pieces I write. For this reason, the number of words used by every character is a significant data to me, and it's in fact my first one. It says something about their nature and about how they communicate. For the same reason, also the number of letters in the words says something about the story. There are moments in which the character I play is too lazy and moody to use long words, for instance. So the second data I extracted was indeed the number of letters. The dialogues among the characters are mature data. Again, they are a reflection of the relationship between them. And the closeness or the distance among them is the fourth one. This is again something that is very revealing about the nature of the relationships in the piece. I couldn't directly extract this information from my play, but I'll talk about it later. In the play, there are three characters, and I'm terrible in naming them, really terrible. In my first play, the names were 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. And in Il punto è questo, the characters are L, P, and A. I used just letters for the names, but there are three characters in this play. I honestly don't know why these are the letters. I am L, and again, I don't know why. But I visualize the three characters as the vertex of a triangle, even if it's not a love triangle. It's very important for me to clarify that. And I use this shape as base to insert my data on. Il punto è questo is divided in 14 chapters. Each chapter has its own shape, and the number of words pronounced by everyone is represented by a sized circle. The lines that you can see, the number of lines, represent the number of sentences from a character to another. You see that here I'm overlaying different layers of information too, as in the example that I showed you previously. Another important aspect of the play is time. In fact, during the story, there are a flashback and a flash forward. For this reason, I visualize every chapter on a scatter plot with a y-axis and an x-axis. And the horizontal axis is the actual chronological sequence of the story, and the vertical one is the order in which the story is being told on the stage. As I mentioned, I think that data visualization and theater can have a mutualistic relationship. Anyway, despite the common points that I mentioned, data visualization and theater, of course, can be considered very different animals coming from very different environments and very different geographic areas. So in order to make them comfortable enough, I decided to put them in two different environments, the stage and a website with an interactive data visualization. The website is the environment in which, of course, data visualization is more comfortable. It knows what's happening there. I designed a website, ilpuntoquesto.com. And it has, I can't code, so the website has been developed by Paolo, who is a very talented developer and a dear friend of mine. I see this website as a window that people can use to explore the play in a way that is a bit different from the classical one. A way to take a peek into it, but without really knowing everything of it, because there is the stage for that. I wanted to start with a white page that the user can progressively fill with forms and with shapes. So the first thing that you can see is a sort of constellation of numbers, the 14 chapters. And then who looks at the website can choose how to build up the visualization, selecting the characters and the visualization of the number of lines and of words. Then clicking on every chapter, the number of letters pronounced in from every character, by every character appears. 1 dot represents 10 letters. And in this case, I wanted to create a minimal, intimate, and evocative space in which who looks at the pages can simply get lost among the flying dots. Moving the mouse over the dots, some quotes from the play appears, and also the voices of the actors who say these quotes can be heard. I didn't want any pictures or video from the play in the website, and the only visual input is given by the data visualization. I self-imposed this constraint to me because I wanted to give data visualization the possibility to be really strictly combined to theater. So in its environment, data visualization is the only actor you can see, and it mixes with the voices of the characters. But then I think that it can also be interesting taking data visualization and putting it on a stage with me and the other actresses. And the stage for me is that magical and terrifying place in which everything can happen. It's a combination of working a lot, studying, refining every detail, and unexpected improvisation, random mistake. Also in data visualization projects, there are mistakes and unexpected problems, of course, but it's not the same thing. In theater, these aspects are essential. The idea here is a real-time data visualization evolving to what's actually happening on a stage. I have to be honest, this is a concept that has been partially explored on a real stage, but it's a feasible one. Again, thinking about it with Paolo Corti, the idea is to use sensors and microphones that can detect and map both the position on the stage and the words pronounced by each actor. As I was mentioning, I strongly believe in the potential, communicative potential of data visualization. And in this case, I think it can empower emotions. Of course, it can be tricky because I'm showing here very simple data, very simple contents, words, dialogues, and distance or closeness. I'm using the shapes to visualize the evolving relationship among the characters and the words used to express themselves. But I think that the fact that in that specific moment, that specific character is alone with no other circles around it, and only a lot of words, so a growing circle, set to herself to fill the white space, I think that it can say something. And to me, the shapes are like megaphones that are silently, yet visually shouting what's happening in the story. And finally, there is another aspect that makes theater so unique, as dance and like music, for instance, and this is irreproducibility. Two performances will never be identical to each other. It depends on factors as the size of the stage, the mood of the actors, or the reactions of the audience. Data visualization offers the possibility to visualize and record all these different performances. And so ideally, after a few shows, we will be able to look at a collection of unique moments that we won't be able to recreate again. And that for this specific reason are so precious. So I'm studying the behavior of these two different animals. I think that data visualization can offer to theater, talking about mutualism, a new language of representation, a new alphabet of forms to use in order to provide another layer of storytelling that fills the eye. The world in which the audience enters during the performance is a weird one, in which everything is visualized in real time, in a composition of gestures, voices, and shapes and visual elements. And I really hope that this mixture, this composition, can be able to donate an intense experience at who's looking at it. My story, the story that I wrote, talks about relationships and loneliness. And I hope that stressing these relationships and this loneliness by visualizing them can add an emotional layer to the play. At the same time, I think that theater can donate to data visualization its warmth and its uniqueness. I think that the animal data visualization can be enriched by the emotional component of theater and by the unexpected consequences of live performing. I think that these geometric shapes can be extremely enriched by the emotions generated by what they are representing. Some time ago, I wrote a piece on this combination, a post on Medium. And after the publication, I was invited to talk about it at a design conference in Milan, Visualized. And they also asked me to bring part of this experiment there. And it was such a joy for me because I had never thought that I could have brought theater to a data visualization conference. And do you remember this slide? This is exactly what happened there. Me and my theater mates started the talk acting because it should have been a surprise performance. It wasn't being announced. But my microphone wasn't working in the first seconds, so everyone was so confused. First of all, because they didn't understand what was happening on that stage, and second of all, because they couldn't hear me, and so they weren't understand this either. But that's on live performing. I then partially brought the experiment on a few stages. Again, partially because I did it without the real-time aspect due to technical reasons. And I then paused the project, but this is still something I often think of. I would love to rework on this project. I don't know how and when, but it's something that I keep in my mind. And anyway, even if I'm not performing in these months, I'm constantly working on communicating. I told you as the concept of a connection with the audience in theater also helped me in having in mind this connection while designing. I think this is essential, it's extremely important, and it's clearly something that I love doing. Thank you very much for the attention.
Thank you, Federica, for the talk. You know, it's all the time I say this experiments. It's something that touches you. That's I think what theater is able to bring. This emotional component. I think it's something that you can feel even in your presentation. So, actually, my first reaction to this, and then we will open. We will make some comments, me and Antonio, but then from our perspectives, and then we will open the conversation and hopefully have Federica responding to some questions. But my first reaction is really about language. And when you think to theater, and then when you see your visualizations, I know that if we look at your work, you put a lot of attention on the inspiration and on the forms that you use. And I guess there is an attempt to create a connection between the phenomenon that you have behind the data, the visualization, the reader. So that's in my opinion, how you use the form. But still, there is something in this language of data visualization that speaks about, science, speaks about something that is abstract. And so how do you see this connection between, the language of the body, the experience that you have in theater, this also the mistakes you were talking about, and this appearance, this allure of, certainty that sometimes you perceive when you look at data visualizations, even when you use, the formal approach that you have, that it's, kind of a step farther from the scientific language of data visualization, but still there is this this aura of exactitude that is in a way the opposite of the mistakes you was talking about, and you have them in play in the same space. How they can it's not really a question, it's a comment. How they can live together, how they can be reciprocal, how they can that can be mutualism with such a difference that I mean that's what I see when I look at the language on stage and the language on the visualization.
I think that data visualization offers a super wide range of potential projects, potential combination, potential shapes. I tend to use when I can, not all of my projects, very organic shapes, because I think that this organicity can really help me in catching the reader's attention and again creating a connection. And I think that also coming back to the visual alphabet concept, I really see the data visualization pieces as they are narrative pieces. I see the visual elements as words, as visual words. And so this is why, to me, there is this strict relationship between the words that are pronounced by an actor and their visual representations. Because I often see data visualization as the equivalent of a long article. And this is why I think that we can combine them. I also think that, I mean, I didn't actually experiment completely on how to combine them, even if it's at Visualize at that conference, there were actual moving visualizations behind us while they were talking. And I think that it would be interesting further exploring it because of that, because they don't have to clash. I mean, they have to be combined organically. And I mean, I've tried. I didn't complete the project, so I don't have a complete, I can't completely respond to it, but I think that would be very interesting to see how they can work together. And yes, this concept of visual alphabet for me is very important.
Okay, I just have another comment, but it's just opening another perspective, showing the work of another student that I had years ago that it was reminded me by your talk. And I will not comment that much, just show this because it's another perspective that maybe can foster the conversation. Let me see if I can share. Yeah, here it is. Do you see the slide?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's a thesis again on communication design, where the student Michele Graffietti, that I should have invited, I don't know why I didn't think to that, but
Next time.
Next time, yeah, that could be the second. He had this idea of staging the data, so creating. So it's not the so in your work, Federica, the stage is the primary, I would say, space for the communication. Here, he was thinking to printed visualizations, but using theater as a metaphor in a way to structure the visualization itself. So he started from the idea of the visual panorama patented by Barker at the end of the 18th century, and with this idea of recreating immersive representations of the world to give people the experience, to make people feel in a way the experience. And he got these very nice pictures about and examples of the visual panorama, and then he used that idea to construct a data visualization. So these are just examples of the work that he produced. It's a representation of information. It's more than 10 years ago, but the idea was the page was the stage, and then the data points were the actors, and then everything was constructed in a way as performing the data set on that canvas. And yeah, literally in the thesis was like, there was like a work of design. So the page was the stage with different areas, with different names and meanings. And then you had the background was designed using some visual references that came from the subject. So what was the topic? And then, the data points were put, in the stage according to the meaning of the data. So that's, again, I wouldn't add anything more than that, but it's just another way to maybe create a connection. So using another stage that is a paper that is spread of a magazine, and use theater as a metaphor of the approach that you have with the data. So I will stop sharing my screen.
Great,
yeah.
Thank you. Federica, thank you so much for your presentations. Fascinating again. I have a few things to respond to, and then I really would like to open to our members in the Q&A. The first thing is that hopefully once this pandemic is over, or whenever we learn how to deal with it better, the Department of Theater will be a great place for you to continue the exploration, because this is exactly what we are interested in doing. At the heart of what we do in theater, I think, is inventing the next moment. And the pandemic is forcing us very quickly to invent new ways of making theater, of sharing theater, of witnessing and understanding theater. So I think that these avenues, these pathways are incredibly fascinating for us. And I'm glad to see there are several of our students on the seminar up in the presentation. I would like to hear from them as well, as we continue to encourage them to think of theater beyond just the making of plays. The other thing I want to say to you is that, to me, it's interesting. The data visualization, to me, seems that what we do in theater is data incorporation. And I wonder what happens, and one of the ways you have been so successful is because of your theater background, you're able to use all of your senses, all of your body in this three-dimensional thing. A student of mine recently asked me, with all of these things that we're doing via Zoom and audio plays and whatnot, when is theater stopping being theater? And to me, it has to do with the communication, the community, the communal experience of witnessing a play that's being incorporated and shared with an audience in the living moment. So I love the idea of contamination, not as the pejorative of like it's going to be, sick and dying, particularly during a plague, but the idea that the contamination can foster new ways of doing things, new ways of creating new species of things. And I love that. The other thing I want to say publicly is that I always bristle a little bit when I hear that theater is about emotions, because I think that's one of the greatest complications that we have, particularly young people who want to do theater. In our society, it might be different in Italy. In our society, most people are not encouraged to express themselves. And therefore, some of us find through theater an ability to be expressive and to have the fullness of our humanity being available to us, particularly our emotional life. But theater and acting are not just about emotion. And that way we do contaminate into sentimentality, which is really complicated and something that, in my opinion, we need to be aware of. So when I think about incorporation, I think about the full body, the fullness of all of our senses, our emotional life, our intellectual life. That's one of the things that bugs me, is that people tend to think of theater as warm and fuzzy and just emotional things like that. And there's such depth and such rigor in what we can do through theater. And it's these kinds of collaborations that I think can really help us foster that understanding. So with that, I would love to open up the session to Q&As from our participants. And as Angelica said before, please either do the chat request to speak and we'll call on you.
And yeah, Antonio, while we are waiting, also commenting what you were mentioning about theater, and it's not just emotions and so on. In Italy, at certain levels, it's very difficult for theater to be taken seriously. I don't know how it's there, but here in Italy and working in theater, it's such a struggle. And this is also why I love to work on this project, because again, theater is the result of choices. It's not random. There are mistakes. It is unexpected, of course, but it's not random. There is rigor behind it. And this is, I think why they can work, theater and database and design can work together, in an interesting way.
Have you ever considered directing a play? I mean, you've acted.
I directed the 2 plays that I've written. I mean, I have no professional background in theater, but I've directed both of them because I wrote them and I just wanted to experiment, and I wanted to experiment on directing and acting, and maybe it's too much, but I mean, not being a professional, I was freer to experiment a little bit on it. And so, yeah, I also directed them.
Yeah, it's really interesting because I think that for us, we tend to think of theater only as the performance part of it. There's so many other layers to the lasagna that make theater into a really tasty dish. There's a layer of research, there's a layer of design, the level of conceptualizing, and the possibilities are endless. Here's a question from Ilya. Ilya, would you like to ask it? You can just read it.
I would just read it, yep.
Okay. So building on Antonio's comment about fullness and intensity of experience, can you talk a little about how visualization interacts with the non-visual elements of theater and performance, elements like embodiment, tactility, and kinesthesia?
Yeah, I don't know, actually, no, in the sense that for me, the connection is that if a person is moving on the stage, then the visualization is following the movements, and this is where you see the connection. And something that I could work, I think, it's not explaining too much what's happening. I think it could be interesting for the audience to just see and slowly understand if the shapes are following the movements, and at the same time, the circles are getting bigger and the lines are getting, the number of lines is increasing according to what's happening. So this is, I think, how they could interact. I mean, the data viz point would be extremely visual, of course. So yes, I don't know about the other. I honestly didn't think about like the tactile experience, for instance.
If I may add something to that, because this connects with an idea that I have in mind about a potential relationship that in a way goes beyond the two stages we were talking about. You know, the page as the, let's say, one of the typical stages for data in data visualization, information design, infographics especially, and the stage, the classical, let me say, stage of theater on the other side. I was thinking, for example, and that's maybe could be a way to respond to that question, or to go in that direction, to use theater, performances as a way to connect with people and data in a certain context. That is the context maybe of the phenomenon that the data represents. So let's go there and let's do something that is based on the data, but that connects with people using the power of theater, the many all the levels of the pack of the dish. So, but you know what I mean? That could be a third, let's say a third stage in general. So that's is not, and that where we use both to engage with people and to, because data are suffering in a way the same syndrome. They are that's my perspective. They are struggling, or they're desperately searching for expressing their emotion because they have been confined into a language so far that is not able to let them express, and so that's why I see data points asking for that level of engagement with people, because nowadays there is kind of a barrier, separation that we call data and literacy, but it's not literacy, it's just that we are not using the right way, the right connection with people. So could it be a way where this exploration worth also to respond, to try to respond to Ilya's questions, how do we work with embodiment in a way that is, so where we don't have one or the other driving, because in Michele's work, the visualization was driving it, that theater was just a metaphor, an analogy for the process. In your work, it seems that in any case, the actors are driving the performance, and then, as you say, the visualization follows. Maybe we can use a third stage to experiment, a stage that is elsewhere, that is in a specific place, to try to experiment with embodiment and proximity, kinesthesia, and all these things. But it's just, it's a proposal. It's not a question. What do you think, Antonio?
I think definitely remember the courses that we have in our department and all the productions that we produce are places of experimentation. So remember, you can use them as a lab to experiment with all those things. And also, you know, as we are responding to the pandemic and to even before the pandemic, to new ways of making theater, ideas that what you showed about immersive performance. Oliver, who's on the call as well, teaching with Francis the class in immersive performance design. These are all incredible possibilities of places in which you could actually collaborate and experiment together. Here's another question from Catherine. Have you explored visualization of audience response to stage performances? This might reveal interesting patterns. The work of our own Professor Danny Snyder-Young comes to mind. Hi, Danny. Hi, Danny.
It's something that with Paolo, with the developer I collaborate with for the project, it's something that we talked about. We talked about how we could also visualize audience and audience response. We brainstormed a little bit, and I mean, there are super basic options. So you could create something, a form, an app, something that the audience can interact with during or after the performance, but I don't think it's interesting. I think it would be distracting. It would be, I don't know, again, something monitoring. It would be interesting having something that is monitoring in real time audience, but I don't know how. Audience is essential. I mean, I was mentioning it before, of course. And you can perceive, while you're acting on a stage, you can perceive audience. You can perceive how things are going, if are going good or if are going terribly bad. And I think it would be interesting visualizing it somehow, and also incorporating it again in real time and being it part of the visualizations. We didn't further explore this path, but I think it could be an interesting one. Without being too distracting for the audience, I think it would be important to not be a distractive element, and so it should be harmoniously incorporated with all the play and what's happening there.
Danny, do you?
Yeah, now I'm curious about Danny, because that's a space where we have to create connection. Who's Danny and what's work he's doing? I'm not aware of that.
Danny, okay, Angelica, can you unmute Danny? Danny's an assistant professor in the Department of Theater, phenomenal creative practice researcher. Danny.
There we go.
There we go. Hi. So
Hi.
nice to meet you. I study audiences. So there are traditions of quantitative audience study. My colleague Scott Mealy at the University of Toronto has these like very interesting methods of quantifying audience response, particularly in relationship to attitude change over the course as a result of, or the performance as a social intervention. But figuring out how to communicate that data in compelling ways and to use data visualization as a method of analyzing those statistics, I mean, that's incredibly interesting and totally a space that's really ripe for collaboration and at this intersection, because audiences produce so much data. Some of it is, I mean, could you track patterns of laughter? Could you track patterns of motion and stillness within an auditorium? When are people shuffling and fidgeting? When are people sitting stock still? Like all of that, that's all that we have the technological means to track all of that, but we don't. But then how do we communicate it and how do we make it legible? So we know it in our bodies in the theater, but how do we make cultural meaning of that? Sounds very cool to me.
Well, that's interesting. It makes me create another connection with, I think it's pretty much the same that, well, more or less, that game design tries to do in a very different, of course, setting. So they're desperately searching to map the reaction of users, the gamers. So how they do play, how did they react to certain stimulus. So and there is a huge field of analytics that is working on, tracking the behavior of gamers, and especially when they play together. And so they create so that's another possible, so maybe some techniques can be mutated by this other field, and so create a tripod connection with, theater, data visualization, game design. Yeah, that's expanding the network of connection. But that's an interesting, I didn't know about that. That's really interesting to me.
Here's a question from Oliver. Did you see your data visualization work impact the direction and or the visual design of the performances? In general, I feel like directing and stage design lives more in emotional and personal responses versus data visualization. So I wondered if the performed elements of the piece followed or worked with the data visualization.
So I think, I'm not sure if I understood the question, but I think that the common point is the presence of choices. So I also think that theater is rational in the sense that if an actor is in that position, it's because of a set of choices and of reasons. And so it is in data visualization as in design in general. So I think they are not so distant from this point of view. Again, because there is a rigor behind theater, even if, of course, the actors then are going to use the gestures and the voice to express emotions, but I think that there is rigor behind it. And so this is why I think that they can dialogue together. And yes, I'm not sure if I've answered the question.
Oliver, do you want to come on camera, Oliver, and talk a bit more about it?
Oh,
Should be.
yes. Hi there. Yeah. Also, I was interested in a little background. I'm a theater designer, and so I guess I was interested because as you were talking about like mapping out the visualization points with data visualization, there's a very, you have these like XY coordinates or places where if you're following this character speaks more in this scene and this character speaks less in this scene. And so there's sort of prescribed data points you're following versus in directing or in design where we may see those points as we're analyzing the play, but there's also a very personal like response we're going to have that the action of the play is dictated not necessarily by the data in it, but by like our personal feelings about it. So I was just wondering in your direction, as you sort of had these charts showing like the way the play functioned from a perhaps more technical perspective, if that impacted or changed the way you like thought about the movement of the characters, the design of the piece in general. Because it seems like a lot of the charts are close to like the things we put together in play analysis or something to gain a deeper understanding of the play. And I wondered how that impacted the more traditionally like not, as Paolo was saying, like the non-scientific world of like the theater.
Yeah, so the data visualizations didn't have any impact on the actual play because when I started visualizing it, I had already written like months prior and also started directing it. So it was a little bit of the contrary. The data visualization helped me in understanding a little bit more what I did writing the piece. So I discovered a few things about the piece after having analyzed it with data. So what I was telling about the fact that, for instance, my character sometimes use very short words just because she's too moody to use long words. It's something that I did, and I mean, I did unintentionally while I was writing. Of course, there is a thought behind it, but it was very instinctual. And then after having visualized the data, I've noticed, okay, so there is a pattern here. And so they were interesting because they showed me the patterns. Maybe they had an influence on the position on the stage. So I had already written the play. I had already in mind the characters' characteristics. But I think it's something that I already had, this idea of seeing the stage as a page and having a visual image of how the character then can move on the stage, I think because of my design background. So again, every position, the reason why a certain character is in that position far from the other ones, and the other one is behind, it's because of a set of choices and thoughts. And so, yes, it's like at the contrary, data visualization made me rethink about what I had written, didn't have a consequences on the actual play, but on how I think about it on the stage. Yes. And I noticed aspects that I wasn't paying attention to.
It came to mind another potential direction. So, work that we have done years ago actually was a dashboard for cyber security. So probably the thing that is the farthest from the theory and motions or whatever. But in that case, we experimented with attributing to the visualization of the marks a behavior. So actually, there were some bubbles on the screen, and the more the data was suggesting that the bubble were representing servers connected in a network. So the more the algorithm predicted that this specific bubble was becoming dangerous, and the more this bubble started to act in a dangerous way. So it was, we created a relationship between the data and the behavior. So it was really behaving like it was getting more and more nervous, and then it was close to explode in a way. So maybe that could be another connection. So maybe we can use something that we mutuate from theater to make data point, the marks in the visualization more expressive, more, to convey more the idea of what is going to happen with those kind of data behind. So yeah, again, it's just to open potential, but also, yeah, maybe we can think beyond the X and Y, the 2 dimensions, using time, using space in a different way. So yeah, that was about time, animating the bubble. So we have time, and time, of course, is very important in theater too. So maybe is also beyond the interaction patterns that we usually have, we can think about data marks in the visual signs in the visualization space in a different way.
Here's another question for Caitlin Fiery, one of our students in the Department of Theater. The data visualizations you've created in response to the movement of the actors has grabbed my attention as a sort of a layered time lapse of the written script. Did the animated data visualization help you discover patterns about the blank spaces or the negative space or the play's world?
Yes, definitely. I mean, the balance between negative spaces and blank spaces, it's something that I often think about when I direct a play, again, I'm not a professional, so it's a little bit weird for me to talk about this, but this is something that I think about, the negative spaces, the relationship that certain position in the space represent. So yes, this is definitely something that I thought about. But I have to say that given that the data visualization in this case is following the actual movements, it made me realize that I was already thinking in this direction. I mean, I was already visually thinking about how the position on the stage, the blank spaces, the negative spaces could have an impact then on the overall composition of the play.
Thank you. Another question for you, King Liu. When you design work for news organizations, how do you balance the artistic aspects and the limited time news audience usually pay? I feel visualizations for the news tend to convey information directly in a certain short time. Somehow it sacrifices the possibility of aesthetic in many ways. Would be interesting to know what you think of it. Thank you.
Yeah. I really think that it depends a lot on the usage context. So this is why it's very important for me to show, for instance, the images posted from the medium I collaborate with, La Lettura, because it shows the context in which they are using that visualizations. I could never use such visualizations in a daily newspaper, for instance. And I think that an infographic can be a tweet or a very long article. It really depends on the context and on how and what are the needs for that particular message. So I think that it really depends on the context. I think that there is space for visual experimentations also in visualizations that are simpler, I think it can work, but it depends also on the structure of a newspaper, for instance. And I think that New York Times, I mean, of course, the New York Times is the best example for me. They are using more and more graphics, even in the printed magazine, the printed newspaper, and even in the front page. And I think this is a great example. Their visualization are generally classical ones, but I think they are a great example of the aesthetic value, clearness, and simplicity. And it's a daily newspaper, so of course they can't work on too complex pieces.
Thank you, Federica. Another question from Gordon. Hi, Federica. You talked about visual inspiration. Medias like Pinterest and Twitter are great resources for designing inspiration. How do you get the inspiration for story writing? In other words, how do you humanize data so that data visualizations can go beyond mere aesthetic visual elements put together and become stories that actually raise people's emotions and awareness?
This is, I think, for me, it's easier to talk about practical examples. So yeah, from design inspiration, yes, I like to take visual inspiration from Pinterest and Twitter a lot. But yes, as for the stories, I think that it's the story itself that is the main element. And from the story and from the contents, then comes the visualization. For instance, just to do a very practical example, in the visualization I don't know if you had the chance to see it, because I see that were 10 minutes late, but I show an example of my visualization piece. It was a complex one for a cultural supplement with very organic shapes and a complex structure. And in the very first seconds, I super quickly show another project, an interactive one, that is a visual narrative of 6 asylum seekers' routes that I met and I interviewed a few years ago. And visually, they're completely different. The pieces for the magazine, again, are organic, are complex. There are different layers of information. The piece on the asylum seekers' routes, it's super clean, it's super minimal, it's super rational. And it's because of the stories, because I wanted to provide a super clean and rational narrative of a topic such as the one of migrations that is sometimes, I think, subject to spectacularization. And I wanted the story to be the main center of the attention and not the shape. But at the same time, I wanted the shape to be communicatively powerful, and I wanted them to tell their stories and their journeys, because I visualized it about their journeys and their experience from their hometown to Italy in that case. And it was because of the story, and also because how they told me about the stories. In our meetings, they were talking about very dramatic experiences, of course, in such a calm, rational way that for me, it can be very natural to visualize them transposing this rationality and this quiet approach. So I think that story first, and I mean, of course, I'm a designer, but story first, content first, and then according to what is the story, what are the data, what is the relationship I can create with the readers, then comes the visual representations and the elements.
Thank you, Federica. So we have a few minutes left in case anybody has any comments or any other questions, Federica, or any other great suggestions for new.
Yeah, I just want to throw something more on the table, because I know there are a couple of one faculty new hire here in CAMD in our college, and also a former student, a student I connected with, that are working with data in dance, dancing data, that could be another, yeah, I'm sure there are many possible connections and overlapping with theater. I don't know, how do you see the relationship between theater and dance? I'm curious about that, because but that's again, this could be another, this could be also other people we connect, and we can maybe create a group of interest around.
Definitely.
Beneficial for data visualization, but also data visualization, data representation in any form can maybe play a role.
Paolo, at some point I'll connect you with Ilya, who asked the first question, who's a postdoctoral associate in the Department of Theater, comes from the world of dance. So he's really interested in examining the ethics of physical interaction and the way that we actually connect with each other physically through the world of dance. I mean, theater as well. There he is. So we'll make another interaction there. But yeah, I mean, this is exactly what mutualism means to me. There's clearly so many possibilities for, I'm just going to keep using it, Paolo, contaminations to occur, so that amazing new things can happen, and we are incredibly surprised. And again, I want to reiterate that our department as a creative hub, a hub for creative practice research, is completely open for experimentation. And there are students such as Caitlin who asked the question, and others that I see on the call are right at the crux of inventing new ways of making theater, interacting with theater, delivering theater. And all of these connections will make it even richer.
Yeah, one area that I already say that, but one area where I think really there is a huge potential for these new ways is engaging people with data. So what data means, because we saw with this pandemic, data were all around. Every newspaper, you had data visualization and data in the front page, in the headlines. But people are really still very far away from understanding what those data and those representation means. And so maybe using theater, we can break through these barriers and open the door for a better understanding, because it will be crucial. So the more we will experience those kind of challenges, very complex, very disruptive, unknown. So the uncertainty and all these things need the data to be understood, but need also a way to be represented, presented, that can connect with people, because we are all involved in this phenomena. So we are all part of it, but only very few understand what's going on, if any is understanding what's going on, but very few, because they know where to read and what to read and how to interpret that. But most of the people, they don't know. And what's worse, they are driven by that in a very improper way. So, and that will be something that we will experience, I think, also during these elections.
Thank you. Laura, please be in touch with either Paolo, myself, or with Ilya directly, and we'll keep making more connections with the world of dance. Federica, thank you again for your time, for being a catalyst for these conversations. Really, really appreciate it. And Paolo, thank you for joining us in this new way of collaborating.
Yeah, thank you, Federica. I'm really happy we reconnected.
Yeah,
and hope to keep in touch. And yeah, maybe you help us really open a new direction for research here. I will keep you posted on that.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It was great. Thank you.
And a great shout to Angelica Montemayor, our CAMD Special Events Coordinator, for helping us make this happening, and Molly and Brittany and all the team. Thank you again. And thank you everybody for giving us your time and your attention. And buonasera, adiós, hasta luego. Muchas gracias.
Bye bye. Thank you everyone.